It was a cold and rainy morning as I exited the first bus on my commute to work. The bus left a thick plume of smoke in its wake as it took off down the road. Seeing that it was safe, I crossed the street and walked toward the connecting stop. Usually, there would have been a handful of people making the same trip with me, but as I had missed the bus I normally take by a matter of seconds, I was running 30 minutes late. As I approached the stop, I was taken with how strange it looked, covered in the thick mist. It was one of those covered stops with thick plexiglass windows. Inside was two benches. About 25 feet behind the structure was overgrown woods cropped back just far enough to be out of the way. On the other side of the street was a strangely desolate strip center. Most of the shops were empty except for a convenience store, an unmarked business with blacked out windows. Don't know, don't care. It's kind of a shady neighborhood, but besides the occasional incident here or there, I hadn't had reason to ever be afraid. This morning, though, was so cold. The air seemed oddly still. I could see as I approached the bus stop an outline of someone sitting in there. From where I was, it was just a dark shape. Clearly a man. He was wearing an old-fashioned hat. I could just make out his silhouette. As I got a little closer, I decided to hang back outside the shelter. I didn't want to make friends if I didn't have to. I have social anxiety, so I tend to hang back in general. I decided to amuse myself as everyone does these days by staring at my phone, texting my friends that would be awake this early, and hopping on Facebook to see if I had any messages. Occasionally, I'd throw glances up the road to see if the bus was coming. The road seemed unusually deserted. Only a few cars passed, and all of them with their windows rolled up, presumably enjoying the dubious comfort of a heater blasting hot air right into their face. I shivered. The wind whipped up, carrying a cascade of leaves down from the trees all around me. And then the sprinkling started. It was light at first, but quickly enough turned to cold, large drops of rain. I shielded my phone and jogged the 20 feet or so under the shelter. I ducked under the roof, and as I turned toward the bench, my gaze quickly shifted past the man who had been sitting there. I almost gasped. He had big, wide eyes, and what I can only describe as an unnatural smile plastered on his face. He was wearing a heavy raincoat, and I sat down on the bench with my backpack between me and him and went right back to my phone. I was somewhat afraid he would think I was being rude if I looked toward him too much, and honestly I wasn't that eager to. The rain picked up. A few cars breezed past the stop, drivers isolated in their own cocoon of luxury. In the corner of my eye, I saw the man on the other side of the bus stop turn his attention toward me. I stared down, pretending to read some message thoughtfully, but all the while I could feel his eyes boring into me. It was starting to freak me out. I could feel my pulse pick up, and my hand that was holding my phone was trembling. I glanced past the man down the road. I saw no bus on its way to deliver me, and I also noticed I was right. The man was staring right at me. I glanced over at him and gave him a friendly-ish smile and a nod. He just stared, with that plastered-on grin. I could feel the smile melting from my face slowly as our eyes locked. He was old and rail-thin. Lines crisscrossed his face in webs of wrinkles. And there was no implied friendliness in that smile. It was more like he was baring his crooked yellow teeth at me. I inwardly reminded myself that I was an adult. He might be mentally challenged, or have had a stroke, and if worst came to worst, I easily had 50 pounds on the guy. Feeling awkward, I stood up and paced to the edge of cover, and gazed longingly up the road. I heard a shuffle behind me and spun my head. The guy had covered half the distance to me. He stopped dead in his tracks when I turned toward him. He swayed lightly on his feet, staring at me. I slipped my phone into my pocket, thinking it would be to my advantage to have both my hands available. The man didn't step any more toward me, but he leaned at the waist. His pale blue eyes locked on mine. I crossed my arms in front of me and took a step back. I felt rain hitting my shoulders. There was a weird moment where we just stared at one another. "Ha!" he said loudly. It sounded like a nervous tic or something, but I flinched. "You're number 25, he whispered in a thick accent. "What?" "You're number 25. He straightened at the waist and then tilted back a little. "Number 25, number 25, he laughed. I didn't know what he meant, so I shrugged. His face changed. His mouth was still grinning, but his eyes looked more severe, and he said, dead serious, 25, you're nothing special. There were 24 before you, and millions after you. You aren't shit. You aren't shit, 25. He smiled, and I weighed my options. I was freaking out pretty bad at this point. 25 is gonna die. 25 is gonna die. He started chanting this as though it brought him ecstasy. Miserable little life runs out in the streets, and only a maggot stopped to mourn him. He pointed straight at me. Something in my brain switched the fuck this switch, and I backed 3 steps into the rain, not taking my eyes off the man. I perceived motion behind me and whirled around as the bus slid to a stop. I threw a glance back at the old man, who hadn't moved, and stepped into the vehicle. I was breathing hard. I swiped my entrance card and made my way to the back. I whipped out my phone and texted my friend, "You will not believe what just happened to me." I hit send. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. I casually glanced up and shuddered in my seat. They were staring at me. All of them. And they all had that same bizarre grin. 25 is dead. 25 is dead, they all began chanting, moving toward me.